Welcome to our program, Professor Persson.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be with you and your listeners.
Ukrainian troops continue its offensive operation deep inside Russia in the Kursk region. Ukraine still holds their terrain. From your perspective, how do you see the implications of this offensive on the Putin's grip on power?
So I'll begin, as I do all of my interviews with you, by noting that these are my personal views that I'm sharing today, not the official position of the United States government or army. But of course, the offensive operations into the Kursk region present many interesting facets that I think we're still just starting to understand. Certainly some of the motivations of those operations, but also the strategic consequences. I think for the moment, the operations into Kursk present a political inconvenience for Putin, but unfortunately nothing that seriously threatens the stability of his regime. Obviously, we know that he's taken great efforts over the last 2.5 years to hide much of the reality, much of the cost of the war from the Russian public. And so obviously this makes that a bit more difficult insofar as the war has directly reached Russian citizens in a way that it hadn't before. That said, we know that he controls the information environment in Russia very tightly. And it seems for now that there hasn't been an upswelling of public dissent from the Russian public in ways that might ultimately challenge his control of the system. That said, I do want to note that it's very difficult to gauge just from looking at the outside the underlying protest potential of a population. Everybody, every Russian citizen perhaps has their own sort of tipping point, their breaking point, where dissatisfaction with Putin's rule could bubble up into visible action. Of course, we don't know where each individual citizen sort of falls on that spectrum. But events like these potentially can, if they accumulate over time, sort of push more and more people to their breaking point, such that eventually it may erupt. But I don't think that the operation in Kursk is big enough or shocking enough, frankly, to sort of all of a sudden motivate people to take the streets in protest of Russia's war.
From your perspective, what kind of operation could shock Russian people and force them to protest, to destroy this Putin's regime? I understand that it's like only speculations, but what is your take on that?
So I'll be honest, I'm skeptical that there's much on the Ukrainian side that the armed forces of Ukraine or the Ukrainian government could do necessarily to spark that. I think really the only thing that might be able to truly shake up the situation and the perception of the Russian public would really be an incredible error, blunder, sort of a disastrous mistake perhaps by the Russian armed forces, but certainly more centrally with Putin's own government and governance. We know from his 25 years in power that he seems to have a non-stick coating on him. And so even if it were some of his elites or even the military itself that were found to have stumbled into some great embarrassing blunder, he still has a pretty unique ability to avoid the blame and to continue on. And so it's why I'm not holding my breath for such an event to happen that ultimately could release his grip on power.
CIA believes that Ukraine will hold this terrain in the Kursk region for a certain period of time. How could this occupation of the Russian land, this capturing of the Suja city and other settlements, how could this influence the stability and fragility of the Putin's regime? Would it be possible for Vladimir Putin and his regime to survive this even long-time occupation of his own land? Because it was the first time since the Second World War.
So again, it's still very early to say, and even to know what the Ukrainian armed forces' long-term plans are for their presence in Kursk is a bit speculative. I have seen very recent reports that there have been sightings of defensive positions, trenches being dug by the Ukrainian side to suggest that they may intend to stay long term. Again, I don't think that the operation in Kursk necessarily threatens the system as a whole. It's a relatively small portion of Russian territory, obviously, that they've held. But it's not on a scale yet, I think, where it would really sort of cause the kind of dissent that might be problematic for Putin's control in the near term. Now, of course, in the long term, it's a very thorny problem for him, even if he is able to distract and divert attention away from the region, because of course, as long as Ukrainian forces hold that territory, they do have some bit of leverage and some bit of influence over the possibility and the course of negotiations. And so I think that is the greater significance, frankly, of Ukraine holding that territory. And that's the longer term problem that Putin is potentially going to have to face as this war continues.
Also, Politico reported that Ukraine would present to the Biden administration a list of targets which could be targeted by the US-made weapons. President Zelensky is pushing Biden administration to allow Ukraine to conduct such deep strikes inside Russia with US-made weapons and UK-made weapons. Do you expect any kind of a new decision from a Biden administration before the general election?
So, from where I sit, and unfortunately I don't have access to the highest levels of decision-making in the American government, just a professor. But from where I sit, the information that I've seen, unfortunately, I'm not particularly optimistic that the Biden administration will grant approval to Ukraine to use those long-range weapons in Russian territory before the November elections. My skepticism draws from, a couple of reasons. One is at the international level. The Biden administration has always tried to take these types of actions, these types of significant policy changes in consultation and in concert, perhaps, with the other NATO allies and the other providers of assistance to Ukraine. And of course, that process requires a lot of back and forth negotiations, and it tends to generate a lot of chatter, a lot of rumors. And so we often have an idea just from leaks and other information sources when these steps are perhaps getting closer to reality. Again, the sources that I listen to and follow, I'm not hearing a lot of that chatter. So I don't think a decision is necessarily imminent. That said, we've also seen a pattern where sometimes the Biden administration seems to quietly give its blessing to another ally to take the step first. We saw that in the discussion over providing tanks to Ukraine, and to other missiles and to F-16s. So in this respect, I think it's worth keeping an eye on the British discussion over whether London will grant approval for Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles against Russian targets. I think if we see that, then it could be an indicator that Perhaps Washington is letting London take the lead, with hopefully the possibility of America following shortly after that. So that was sort of the first sort of set of considerations. The second comes down to American domestic politics. Of course, as you noted, we're in the final stages of a very intensely contested presidential election. And I think that raises a couple of issues. I think that the Biden-Harris administration is going to be reluctant to take any steps that might cause waves or otherwise alter the dynamics of the campaign. We know that Donald Trump is in favor of scaling back American aid to Ukraine. Potentially, he's made those statements publicly. And we also know that he generally favors a worldview where America is less involved in international conflicts. And so I think sort of raising this issue now certainly would complicate Vice President Harris's campaign to keep the election focused on the issues that she wants to focus on. The other challenge that American domestic politics sort of inserts into this is, we have this saying in America in election years, beware the October surprise. It seems that time and again, something significant can happen in October just before the election that can significantly alter the dynamics of the race. And so perhaps concern that if permission were granted and if Ukraine were to use American weapons on a Russian target, that then provoked perhaps an unexpectedly severe Russian response. Again, that could shine the spotlight back on this issue right before the election in ways that I don't think that the Biden administration or Vice President Harris really would necessarily welcome. So, hopeful that perhaps after the election, in that period between the election and the winner takes office in January, that's where I would perhaps hope to see a change in policy when it's a little bit more feasible domestically.
Associated Press also reported that Ukraine's offensive deep inside Russia in the Kursk region is putting more pressure on the US administration to act and to provide Ukraine with additional weapons and also to allow Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia. Do you see such implications from this offensive in the Kursk region? Do you see such implications of it?
Well, so I think the Kursk operation provides a very powerful demonstration that Ukraine can successfully conduct significant offensive actions, and that they have both the capacity and the will to continue fighting. And so I think it just perhaps reinforces what I have long known, which is that Ukraine can fight and can win when it's supplied with the necessary resources. And so I hope that message is certainly getting through to Washington. I also think it plays a very important political role diplomatically in frankly, shaping the conversation about eventual peace negotiations. Now, my perspective is a little bit different from many analysts. Many people have said that, well, if Ukraine holds on to this territory in Kursk, then, perhaps later they can use it to bargain with Russia and perhaps trade it for the return of Ukrainian lands. I don't think that's the main significance of this moment in the discourse over negotiations. I think the really important piece is that, we were, this past summer, we were in a period where there were growing calls to put pressure, Western pressure on the Ukrainian government to come to the negotiating table. And these were fueled by sort of the perception that the battle had become stagnated or worse, that Ukraine was losing. And so whenever Ukraine is sort of struggling on the battlefield, this is when we see sort of new voices, louder voices calling for negotiations with the implicit sort of belief that it's time for Ukraine to think seriously about making concessions, territorial concessions, perhaps, policy and security concessions. I don't think that the time is right for those sorts of negotiations, mostly because I don't think that Vladimir Putin has any interest in ending the war on anything less than his maximalist terms. And so, again, this bold action in Kursk, I think, has halted that talk for now of pressuring Ukraine to the negotiating table, and frankly keeps alive the hope, which I also think is the reality that yes, Ukraine can win this war if they are adequately supported.
From your perspective, has this narrative of unwinnable war in the United States, was this narrative completely destroyed by this offensive operation, or there are still some people who really think and who really share this opinion?
So I think that among the analyst and scholarly classes, we all tend to have pretty firm beliefs about the underlying causes of the war and the conditions under which the war can end. And so those skeptics, I think, certainly remain. But again, as I said, I think the attention and sort of the more popular political discourse, say, among members of Congress and among just the citizenry, I think those have been paused by this operation because everybody now realizes that no, in fact, it remains a dynamic situation where Ukraine can succeed in important ways. Unfortunately, no myth, no sort of problematic perspective ever dies completely. And so, I do worry that, as we enter perhaps into the winter, we know it will be a very difficult winter for Ukraine. And so, I'm hoping that the momentum that Ukraine has built with this Kursk operation, and not just the military momentum, but again, sort of the momentum in morale and public opinion will endure, so that in another few months we don't continue to hear again those skeptical voices, sort of raising their heads again, saying that it's time to negotiate and it's time to make concessions.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also said that he would present a plan for Ukrainian victory to US President Joe Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, and former US President Donald Trump. What does it mean from a political point of view, and how could it influence the course of this war and our future relations with the US administration?
So I think in all three of those cases, the three individuals you mentioned, it is an important opportunity to demonstrate that the Ukrainian side has a theory of victory and a plan for getting there. Obviously, I don't know the contents of President Zelensky's plan, but again, I think demonstrating that is very important to show whoever's in power in Washington that this isn't a hopeless, lost cause. Now, of course, I think that plan will be received differently by the various individuals and the presidential candidates. And so, in that respect, I think it really does depend on the details of Ukraine's theory of victory, its definition of victory. If Ukraine believes that this is a war that they can continue to fight for the very long term with a goal of reclaimed sovereignty and control over Ukraine's rightful, internationally recognized post-1991 territories, that is a version of the outcome that I think President Biden and Vice President Harris are going to be much more receptive of. President Trump, on the other hand, again, has expressed more skepticism. And, he has also famously asserted that he has the ability to achieve some sort of negotiation, some sort of settlement. I think he said he could even do it in 24 hours, very easily and quickly. Obviously, he presents himself as a gifted deal maker, and so I have to assume that in President Trump's head, whatever this wonderful deal is that he's going to strike, he probably thinks that it will entail significant Ukrainian territorial concessions. Perhaps it includes other policy concessions like a promise that Ukraine will never join NATO. I don't know, obviously, what exactly President Trump is thinking. So if we have a scenario where in his mind, sort of an end to the war requires significant Ukrainian concessions, and President Zelensky's plan conceives of victory as the restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty, obviously, those two views conflict. And so President Zelensky might find himself sort of less well received, shall we say, or his plan less well received by President Trump.
And my last question for you, President Zelensky also said that this plan would also consist of diplomatic means of pressure on Russia, economic means of pressure on Russia, and other tools. How should this plan look like from a US standpoint? I mean, how do you see this diplomatic and economic pressure on Russia, and even maybe also military pressure, security assistance for Ukraine? How do you see this plan from the US administration's perspective?
So again, speaking personally, and not for the administration or the government, again, it's a little bit tricky to answer that question without knowing some of the details of the plan and ultimately sort of the long-term objective of Ukraine. I think publicly, again, the Ukrainian government is clear that their goal is to restore sovereignty over their rightful territory. And so how do we get there? Again, I'm very skeptical that negotiations and diplomacy will ever get this conflict to that point, simply for the fact that Vladimir Putin and his regime seem 100% committed to this day to achieving sort of their original maximalist objectives of controlling Ukraine and treating Ukraine as a puppet whose leadership they ultimately can pull the strings on. So I don't see any willingness or any realistic feasibility for the Russian government to negotiate in good faith with Ukraine. Then the question becomes, how do we continue to pressure Russia to allow Ukraine to make further advances on the battlefield, where I actually do think that this war will ultimately be settled. And so in the economic realm, obviously, there are a wide range of additional economic measures that the West can take, stronger enforcement of sanctions and monitoring, cracking down on exports of prohibited dual-use technologies to third-party countries that we know are then being re-exported to Russia, tighter controls on the trade of Russian energy under the price cap mechanism, and so on and so forth. And so again, the purpose of this isn't to generate, an overnight change in Russian policy. It's to slowly strangle the Russian war machine. And so I think that's a very, very important effort in influencing the course of this war. Russia, unfortunately, I think Putin will continue fighting as long as he has missiles to send. and other weapons. And so we need to make sure that he can't get the microprocessors and other chips necessary to send those weapons.
Thank you, Professor Parson, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Героям слава! Дякую!